Chapter 10. Unbiased Inferences. I mundanely walked along the busy, cold, wet street towards the monorail station as I began the morning obedient to my new, marginalized, expected work routines, like a predictable stationary process of an obedient endogenous epsilon node, the lowest sigma ranking. I stood apathetic aboard the monorail carriages while standing quashed in between the hordes of huddled, indifferent commuters. I stared out of the monorail window in my now usual vacant, semi-depressed state, down through the intermittent monorail bridges as I observed the little busy nodes down below, all grey and wet, rushing through the streets, across roads, onto and off buses, dodging each other, yet collectively they resembled a huge, dynamic, singular, random morphing system, almost like a huge, morphing, grey, pulsating amoeba. Singular, yet comprising the collective commuting nodes and pedestrians, synchronized this disorganized giant organism, heaving and contorting upon the wet street. The collective animated vigor and passion of the nodes gave the imaginary organism life. It gave the city streets and buildings an energy, coupled with the energy of the rain and the weather, giving the morning a refreshing, vital ambience. I drew solace, a therapy from watching my fellow endogenous nodes running to and fro, accentuated in the falling rain, as they were all contributing, obediently, confidently to the great regression function of state utopia's beta. I felt once again proud to be like them, to be a contributing, loyal, stationary processing endogenous node, contributing to the utopian state, accepting the state's apodictic, null hypotheses, and of the great, given, fixed societal mean. It is the best it can be, the contrived data and confirmation bias to fit around a preordained mean, a preordained blue, a best linear unbiased estimator. This sentiment conveyed to me that I was truly sane once again. I was a normal, confident, mean-thinking, normalized endogenous sigma node, nestled safely within the confidence interval quotas of the utopian state. A confident, economically efficient node, nestled once again safely within the confidence intervals given, known, fixed monthly quotas of the great beta population regression function. As an epsilon node, I now accepted it. I deserved it for my past transgressions, my past doubts of the utopian state, my ingratitude of being offered a possible promotion into the alpha ship of the great state utopia. Now I was content to happily exist in the lower end of the confidence interval within my marginalized sigma caste, indefinitely. I noticed on the outside of the monorail window a random array of different-sized, shaped water droplets formed on the glass. I watched as they slithered downwards, pulled by the inescapable gravity, coupled by the wind drag, sucking some of them backwards. Inevitably, a random sample of droplets slowly lost adhesion to the sample space of the glass, their cohesion surface tension buckling, deforming, and then inevitably succumbing to the wind drag force. Yet they definitely broke up just before falling from the window into the turbulent abyss of the glassless realm. Yet they left behind smaller water droplet versions of themselves. These remnants of a water droplet clung onto the side of the window, too small to be sucked off by the wind, drag, its adhesion vital, and too strong to immediately succumb to gravity. The rain droplets were similar to all living creatures. The nodes animatedly lived, yet they inevitably succumbed to the exogenous superior forces of the wind drag and gravity, outside of the two-dimension sample space of the glass. Yet they spawned little water droplet offspring before they died, that would carry on their defiant fight against the inevitable exogenous forces that rendered them mortal whilst they defiantly clung onto the outside window and chaotic, turbulent, probabilistic atmospheric manifold, creating countless exogenous shocks to the relative dimension of the stationary glass window's sample space and adhesive properties. This rain droplet realm, a partial derivative existence formed upon the window, exhibited a similar model of the nodes outside, their movements and patterns transformed onto a different, two-dimensional sample space. But the movements of the rain droplet and the newly forming ones were random, stochastic, not controlled by the glass realm, only by the chaotic, random, exogenous, turbulent storm of the passing wind drag. A proxy for the probabilistic ether. I strangely derived an inward therapy from staring at these dynamic scenes every morning from the window of the monorail which towered above the roads and side streets of primary sample space. Its intermittent, huge, gleaming white pillars towered above the road. Its ultra-modern, all-white monorail effortlessly glided along the track, high above. It was as if there were some nagging variables missing in my psyche about death and the nodes, but this water droplet rebirth and defiance in the face of inevitable, insurmountable odds somehow consoled me. I purposefully took the monorail to King's Cross tube station, even though it was out of the way. It made no sense, as the journey was much longer and more expensive. Yet I gained solace from observing and inferring the node's stochastic routines and the water droplet's defiant rebirth in the face of inevitable entropy. It reminded me of my foggy past that I could not quite remember as an econometrician of some sort at the Ministry of Inferences. I had forgotten. Now it did not matter. Even though now I was a proud, contributing, endogenous, low-ranking sigma, epsilon, node, janitor at King's Cross tube station, I still retained a latent, distributed, lagged interest in the statistical movements and routine process of the commuting pedestrian nodes. It brought me an intangible contentment to escape the mundane, apathetic ordinary, to observe mathematics, its patterns, routines, and infallible systems unfolding around me. All systems tend towards an infallible mathematical structure. Yet I am fallible, therefore I am no system, I concluded. I hoped this minor thought, which exhibited no excessive emotions, would not be detected by the scanners. I opened up my Ministry of Archetypes medicine and took a sip, as I was expected to do this hour. It would keep me from relapsing into the psychosis of the exogenous realm. As I looked out of the monorail carriage window, I resided in a different world inside my mind, calculating, appreciating, inferring the chaotic dances and restricted random movement of the nodes below as they traversed the pavement and crossed the wet streets intermittently. Every footstep of the wet nodes left minor puddles and resonating, interfering waves that for a few microseconds transverse their puddle ocean with the same intensity and pride as imposing waves would do on the Atlantic Ocean during a stormy grey day. Yet the state no longer cared about the finer nuances of my mind and my implied thoughts, as I was now an epsilon node. What was worse, I thought, to be continually monitored and have every thought dissected or to be cut adrift, to a marginalized fate where no one cared what I thought or felt. But it was not to be dwelt upon. I was a toilet cleaner now, and I would welcome a new surname beginning with E, which I was relatively certain would be issued at any time soon. I could connect to the endogenous sigma nodes conceptually from my transient position, whilst I witnessed their relative fleeting positions as I voyeur into their lives momentarily, high above on the monorail, noting them, their faces, their expressions, their clothes, their body language, their movements and patterns, instantly analyzing them and superficially classifying them. As the never-ending stream of nodes appeared and disappeared in each street, as the monorail whooshed past high above. The irony is that I still was classifying and quantifying, predicting the nodes from a high, untouchable position. But now I was completely powerless, no longer within the nurturing care of the ministry of inferences. I was now sane, although depressed. Depression itself was perhaps the mind's own created lobotomy, emotional repression, ultimately constraining the nodes within their own restricted thoughts and routines, to a point where I no longer was aware or even cared about the countless options the world had to offer. Now just accepting whatever the utopian state decided, to counter the madness of the exogenous individuality, of the free will, and the intangible imagination, or irrational beliefs and ideologies falling outside of the state-sanctioned propaganda quotas. As the medicine sank into my stomach and diffused into my bloodstream, I felt the stationary, warm, chemical hand of the state enter my body, and I was grateful. Any probability of a slightly exogenous or statistically significant wrong thought being realized slowly disappeared as I was healing once again twice daily when ingesting the medicine. I felt stationary, constant, stable, reliable, and obedient within the quotas of the non-stationary homoskedasticity. I was a true epsilon node now, who would slavishly follow every expected routine, emotion, implied thought, consumption, and work quota, to the T. This society we live in, it is the best it can possibly be. I concluded whilst within my solitary meditative observations and inference aboard the monorail. Yet I was still analysing the nodes, still looking down at them, from a lofty, yet distant, and ultimately lonely position, even now, as a lowly epsilon node. I got off the monorail and made my way down the steps into the New King's Cross toilets. I stood quietly in the changing room whilst putting on my blue overalls. "Morning, Bays," greeted Euler as he walked in. "Morning, Euler," I replied. "Wet weather again," he responded. "Keeps the streets clean, I suppose," I replied almost automatically in a mundane, complacent tone of submissive optimism. Euler was my fellow Epsilon work colleague who was probably assigned to befriend and watch over me, I am sure. He seemed too intelligent and competent to be a simple, ignorant Epsilon node. I considered his name signified not only that he was a Epsilon node, but perhaps alluded to the famous equation where all the primary symbols of notation, multiplication, addition, exponentiation, equalities, transcendental numbers and imaginary numbers are used, all comprised into a compact equation equaling 0, just like I was now. As I was now in a perpetual marginalized position within the great linear regression model of the state, no matter what I tried to do within this society, it would always regress me to a 0 financial and societal utility position. But they need not bother, as I was completely cured of my madness. I was now a firm believer of the utopian state, more so than I'd even been before. This time I need not even hide my thoughts, which were limited, repressed by my subtle permanent depression, embarrassment by my past actions, which I had now learnt, were wrong. A janitor was what I deserved. I had betrayed the utopian state, the best system that there could be. What other alternative was there? Nothing. Nothing filled my mind most days as I cleaned the toilet cubicles reeking of diluted bleach. In the dimly yellow, lit node, public toilets at King's Cross monorail tube station. I never wavered in my new dedication to the job, as it was my duty, my rightful punishment to endure the menial, humiliating job. Another arbitrary epsilon janitor appeared at the toilet entrance. I have a problem. A young unbiased has lost his originator. Would you hold on to him while I track her down? No unbiased are allowed in the node toilet cubicles, you know, I said, following the strict protocols of the underground tube station. Okay, we can hold on to him for a while, replied Euler. Can't you baize? Smiled Euler cheekily, looking in my direction. I looked a bit shocked, but said compliantly, well, okay then. The little unbiased was about 8 years old and stood by the doorway sobbing to himself, whilst tears ran down his flushed cheeks. The little unbiased was well dressed and looked like he came from a good family. He stood alone, looking scared and upset. I immediately felt sympathy for this vulnerable little, innocent, unbiased. I had not felt sympathy for anyone since my rehabilitation. I approached the unbiased to detain him whilst Euler went to look for his originator, but I also wanted to console him because I do not like to see a node cry, especially an unbiased. As I approached the unbiased, I said, "Hello," in a silly, high-pitched voice, coupled with an over-exaggerated smile. It was the way an adult sometimes greeted an unbiased, trying to get into their innocent mentality. Fighting back the tears, the little unbiased looked up at me sheepishly with his big innocent blue eyes and replied, "Hello?" The unbiased asked, "Are you going to find my originator?" "I don't know where she is," I replied. "I want my originator," cried out the little unbiased and began to sob uncontrollably. I replied in a soothing tone, "Don't worry, we will find her." But I did not know who or where she was. As we waited there in the entrance of the public toilets of the underground tube station, the little unbiased began to calm. The now reassured little unbiased and myself watched all the nodes scurrying to and fro throughout the tube station. The little unbiased sipped on a soda drink that I bought him from the vending machine as we stood and watched the Sigma nodes hurrying past on their continual quest to satisfy their expected mundane daily work routines and personal consumption. The little unbiased asked me completely automatically and genuinely, "Why do all the nodes look so sad?" I was shocked by the deep, innocent, insightful inference and question. I found myself fumbling for an answer, at first trying to look for an answer as my new role as an uncle figure whilst addressing the little unbiased, but I could not find one. So I tried to look deeper into my new, reformed, adult psyche. But there was no answer there either. Yet within my deeper self I felt some muted, blurred, repressed, intangible answer lurking within my damaged yet reformed new stationary psyche. Some sort of discontent for the current system, but I could not comprehend any meaning or find any words to tell the little unbiased. I simply replied, "I don't know." The unbiased continued, "Why do they walk so fast and funny?" Again, I was shocked at the simple, innocent observations and inferences that only an innocent unbiased could ask. His innocence cutting away all the superfluous lies, illusion, statistical augmentation, trimming and packaging of the statistically compliant society that we found ourselves immersed in. I searched my psyche for some answer, yet I found none. I paused, then stammered as I struggled to deal with the little unbiased's innate intangible innocence that cut through to the underlying truth of the situation. "I am not sure," I replied again. "Why do they all go to work at the same time?" continued the little unbiased. "Well," I replied, trying to give some answer to a seemingly simple yet complex question which involved sophisticated statistical and behavior analysis, which I had spent my whole career at the Ministry of Inferences working on. I blurted out in a desperate attempt to hold on to my newly rehabilitated mindset. "Because they work to keep the economically efficient state running harmoniously." The little unbiased stopped staring at the crowds and sipping on his soft drink and looked up at me, saying nothing but giving me a questioning look of disapproval. It was a look of perhaps of not fully understanding the adult dialogue that I had replied with, or perhaps a deeper look of knowing far more than I about the question and answer, that my response was wrong and was not meant to have been said. I could not work out which type of look it was, but the look that the little unbiased gave me made me feel embarrassed with the answer I had just given. These innocent questions by the little unbiased was slowly starting to erode my current emotionally depressed, reformed, compliant psyche. These questions from the little unbiased, who I felt empathy for, whose innocent mind had not yet been subjected to the full glare of the controlling state's propaganda and conditioning, was asking inadvertently many simple yet deeply relevant questions. These questions triggered my deep, repressed inner consciousness, starting to stir my emotions and send psychological exogenous shock waves deep into my depressed, reformed psyche that enveloped me in a patriotic and ever-compliant fog of deluded perceptions and statistical conformity, since being released from the Ministry of Archetypes' augmentation clinic. I then found an answer to the little unbiased question. I exclaimed, "Conditional probability," as if Archimedes himself was exclaiming, "Eureka!" Conditional probability causes the nodes to all walk together to work because they all have a job. The current probability arises because of the existence of past probability events. They are realizing probability events due to given prior probability events having taken place. "So you see, they all go to work because they have jobs," I said, relieved, even patronizing the little node, who still looked at me, not amused, as if not comprehending the answer or having a deeper, innocent wisdom that rejected my conditional probability hypothesis. The little unbiased's originator finally appeared, looking visibly upset whilst being ushered in by Euler. She broke into tears when she saw her unbiased running up and embracing him. After a few minutes of the emotional reunion, she managed to fight through the tears, saying that they both had passed through an automatic tube station door, but it suddenly locked in with her unbiased on the other side. Fortunately, after a while, the door had become unlocked as mysteriously as it had been locked. The originator could not thank us enough for returning her unbiased. She then walked off with her unbiased. I was grateful that it was just a case of an unbiased losing sight of its originator for only a while, but I was also grateful to the unbiased for being the catalysis to clear my mind and to indemnify my psyche back to the prior Ministry of Archetype period. I returned to my toilet cleaning duties. As I cleaned the urinals and toilet seats, obsessively almost enjoying the hopeless, mundane ritual of no thoughts, no responsibilities, to just accept my marginalized position, which I deserved, Yet in the deep recesses of my psyche there were nagging questions or feeling about something being quite not right. A name shot into my mind. I could see it written in calligraphy writing. Arcadia. I could not quite remember what that meant. I then considered conditional probability when it's contemporaneous. Realized. An event existing now, given the existence of a prior event, previously being realized, creating this current probability situational event. Differing connected probable outcomes, creating a continuous series of interconnected realized outcomes, a cornerstone of the Bayesian equation, separating it from statistical classical models. The state wanted current events and results realized, given a prior engineered event, and probabilities having existed, so it could perpetuate and predict the self-obligating statistically complaint nodes, whose prior and current conditional probability events would process seamlessly, interchangeably, like an electromagnetic light wave, fluctuating continually between an electric field perpendicular to a magnetic field, continuing to propagate onwards, forever within a fixed stationary frequency, a predictable, deterministic mean. The state engineer all the conditional events and probabilities arising, creating a propagation of future predictable events, realized outcomes, to maximize its economic efficiency model, the stationary trend of the great beta. All to perpetuate, with near certainty and complete predictability, the aggregate demand curve. Yet the utopian state does not completely control conditional probability. Even though I stand in this currently realized, statistically constrained, situational event, created relative to a previous engineered, utopian state sanctioned event. Conditional probability reaches far beyond the scope of the utopian state sanctioned confidence interval. Perhaps conditional probability coupled with freer thinking could be an alternative hypothesis to that of the statistically constrained state utopia. I felt a part of the little unbiased innocence had somehow seeped into my current reformed complaint psyche, making my psyche tainted with a refreshing innocence, an unbiased perspective, making me appreciate every splendid creation and the wonder of reality. The cumulative total of all conditional probabilities realized so far. The trees, the sky, the nodes' vital faces. Even the urinal was a beautifully smooth white design. I was appreciating and questioning everything, with an unbiased inference, an innocence. Perhaps this was the spark of my inner psyche, igniting its past remnants to burn brightly once again. I realized then that I had felt a shadow of my former self until now, like the shadow residing within the node's dark recesses of their psyche. Yet I had submitted to the state's statistical quotas, allowing my will and imagination to be rendered a constant, a predictable stationary process, endlessly processing the correct frequency relative to a given, official known, fixed mean. Perhaps the statistical quotas was the dark shadow incarnate that I allowed myself to be immersed in, devoid of a will and imagination, replaced by the ever-present given out known fixed mean of the utopian state. But I decided to act as if nothing had changed to continue my expected rehabilitated routines and present a depressed persona. I swept up the countless brown and yellowing leaves outside the train station, which were discarded by the autumn trees. Their leaves, a metaphor for the discarded thoughts of the endogenous sigma nodes, who were ruthlessly preened, as well as self-preening their minds, intentions, imagination, and their very free will. to adhere to the strict statistical confines of the utopian state. The leaves are perpetually trimmed from the trees, a symbolic minus of the unwanted, inconvenient truths that the nodes and even the trees produce. I was now relegated to a caste of a humble janitor. That could no longer affect the state or the nodes within. Marginalized and isolated in my lonely job, only Euler, the probable spy, watched me as I left to go and sweep the halls of the train station and the foyer outside. It was a fair treatment, and just a position for me to obsessively sweep and stroke away the dirt of the state. Maybe a metaphor for my old position. Now I sweep the autumn leaves of the trees. Fallen brown leaves, all different shades of brown, once green, now hard, brittle and discolored, ready to crumble and crackle under the weight of the mighty broom. I likened the discarded leaves to the discarded thoughts of the nodes, relative to the trees. Metaphor. Trees seeming like brain as their Fibonacci ratio branching iteration, towards a curved fractal horizon of the leaf canopy silhouette periphery, similar to the decision binary branching of the node's thoughts. The canopy, resembling a brain, as I imagined in the Ministry of Archetypes, and as Arimer mentioned too. I swept up the discarded thoughts of the tree's fallen leaves, or perhaps pruned by the ever-transient state's horticulturists. Like unwanted thoughts, or restricted thoughts, pruned by the state or self-augment by compliant nodes, forcing themselves to think within the confidence interval, to think mean, to be confident, to wrap their thoughts, intentions and emotions around the known, given, fixed mean, wrapping themselves within the enveloping, normalized distribution of expected thoughts, relative to their caste, like all organisms do, wrapping themselves around the probability-derived niche they find themselves residing in. Their actions and intentions wrapped around their environmental niche in the most efficient manner, indefinitely, until changes due to random probability of the relative randomness of their chaotic actions and intentions of the nodes, to change their niche environment, to suit their biological needs and ideologies. As I raked the leaves into large piles that represented the state's bloated government departments and institutions, my mind began to wander whilst my body continued its automatic default stationary processing around a given known fixed biased mean of the expected janitor chore cleaning routines. My subconscious also processed, but with a more unbiased, innocent process, coupled with an open-minded prior on most subjects, yet still obediently staying stationary within the fixed, no, give mean of statistical conformity. Yet I was considering conditional probability, and how it affected the present, relative to a past situation with its variance which spread out and over the confidence interval, and far into the infinite void of all possibilities, whilst I toiled at the entrance of the tube station, breathing out plumes of misty vapour into the cold evening air. My mind wandered back into its usual plane of thought, into the almost intangible realm of the imaginary number plane, as it usually did while sitting on a tube carriage or staring out of a raindrop-specked window. I thought the letter I denotes the imaginary number which resides off the real number plane of the x-axis, in its murky, irrational plane rotating and morphing around the real numbers in its polar radians. Only in the imaginary plane do the imaginary numbers exist, yet influence the real numbers. As Gauss said, the imaginary numbers do exist as alternate numbers. Yet I only momentarily exist freer within the imaginary number plane, independent of my automated subconscious and body, which is permanently trapped within my endogenous sigma cast, within the thick, statistically controlled ether of the real number dimension, which is controlled and monitored every moment. Only when my mind is immersed into the alternate dimension of the imaginary number plane am I truly free to think and feel when sitting on some tube carriage. My mind's higher. Consciousness resides fixed at the end of my gaze, the apex nestled inches in front of an adjacent seated passenger node's chest, or in the past when I sit bored at work, staring at the continual flow of real-time data, my mind washing away into the imaginary number plane. Only when my higher consciousness is within the imaginary number plane am I free to be truly me, free of the utopian state's scanners and control. Whilst my consciousness resides within the imaginary plane, I am a free-thinking individual. I become almost intangible to the scanners and the state. I become a true individual like the I notation of the imaginary number. The complex conjugate of the complex numbers squared with all the probabilities contained within the complex number plane, free of normalized distributions, free to just be, within perhaps the unrealized, unconditional probability realm. My mind returned to the real number-line existence of state utopia once again, back to the mundane, apathetic world of the compliant endogenous sigma nodes. Back to my body. Back to the sweeping of the discarded brown, yellowing leaves. The pile's size was significant now. I then realized I had lost my E-graph key ring given to me by the Ministry of Archetypes, so I may contribute once again to the great state. I felt the anxiety rise up within me as I frantically looked for the E-graph key ring amongst the countless piles of discarded leaves. My fingers fumbled desperately, searching inside my pockets whilst I searched for the key ring. I needed to find my E-graph key ring, my proof of my compliance, of my contribution to the great utopian state, proof of my stationary wellness and mean, compliant sanity. That I was a productive, contributing, endogenous healed node, a shining example of the Ministry of Archetype Clinic's medical acumen. I started to frantically sweep back and forth, trying to move the leaves about, to unsettle the piles, and find the E-graph key ring. Time was running out. I was scheduled to be back at the train station to finish off the other cleaning duties. Ironically, my search for the E-graph key ring would interfere with my E-graph data. My confidence interval quota compliance. I slowly stopped frantically sweeping as my body began to tire. I then decided to refine my search with a more sophisticated, methodical, calculated manner. I decided to limit the sample plane to just a specific section of the cobblestoned, leaf-covered entrance yard where I had been sweeping for the last hour. I then started to update my initial search assumption, my prior. Within my calculations, I removed possible sample sections of the floor area where I had been fully conscious within the real number plane reality of my default consciousness. But in those areas where my mind had drifted into the imaginary number plane of my subconscious, I marked off a perimeter of that uncertain sample plane region. I then started to focus my prodding on specific least intuitive areas of the forecourt. It seemed logical, in a counterintuitive way, as the first place a search is conducted never really produces a result. I intuitively realized that the E-graph key ring should be perpendicular to where I initially assumed it had been, within the least intuitive region. I remember in the past losing a set of keys and eventually finding them in the least initiative perpendicular circumference arc. Within a minute of implementing this calculated search, I found the E-graph key ring nestled behind a heap of leaves. I then realized that there was a floating mean. a superior mean that I had found during my search within the leaves. I then realized the importance of the Bayesian updating prior, and of its unknown floating mean reality. This search, coupled with the little unbiased coaxing me earlier to consider the realm of conditional probability, a variable within the Bayesian optimization equation, its great Bayesian equation embedded with conditional probability, resulting in a continually iterating, updating, free-floating mean. I now felt free once again, because I had now realized an independent alternative hypothesis of any lurking unattainable names of white, Arcadia, and confidence interval, which I still could not infer the significance of those worlds or concepts, but it did not matter. And now I had an independent alternate hypothesis. At the very core of the probabilistic reality of the real number line, there was the utopian state's given, known, fixed, biased mean. And then there was the slightly freer, unknown, fixed, unbiased mean of the classical statistics. Unlike at the Ministry of Archetypes, where I could not produce an alternate hypothesis to justify my rebellion and sanity, now I felt freer and rejuvenated once again, but this time I felt confident within myself, not in state utopia's confidence interval quotas. I continued my work at King's Cross public toilets, careful to not change my routines or my regular, inane, superficial dialogue with Euler. But deep inside, I felt reinvigorated and free once again. I returned to my solitary apartment that I was still allowed to use, even though it was allocated only to the beta nodes. I would still be allowed to use it until the end of the year. Then I would be permanently downgraded to an epsilon caste accommodation. I walked into the small, familiar apartment which brought back a flood of unpleasant, inhibited, dormant emotions. I was almost shocked to see what I had expected. The furniture, all my clothes, ornaments, everything all turned upside down and knocked over. I knew the normalized police would come and rip the place apart looking for evidence. Yet it still shocked me to see the incarnation of that prediction unleashed upon my private sanctuary, my pseudo-safe individual sample space ruined and defiled. As I sat there trying to calm my thoughts, I noticed that the router and monitoring device were dismantled too. I went to try to and dutifully plug them back in, as I was still a loyal, compliant, endogenous node, a healed, exogenous node. As I fumbled around behind the upside-down coach, I found behind a window blind a glass which was half full of a liquid. I sniffed it. It smelt of alcohol. I never drink alcohol. I started to reposition the furniture back, leaving the glass untouched behind the blind, whilst I cleaned up the apartment. Just then, I noticed a magpie bird entangled in the windowsill on the washing line. I untangled it and continued cleaning. 2 hours later, I sat exhausted as I kept thinking about the alcohol glass. I had a faint memory of an unbiased binary giving me a bottle of alcohol, but I was not sure. There was a no other binary resident in the apartment block. I was about to plug in the data monitoring coaxial cable back online so I could be a proud contributing endogenous sigma node of the utopian state. But as I was about to plug in, I saw the magpie returning. It stood on the windowsill. It had a shiny thing in its beak. It dropped whatever it was at my feet, as if to thank me for untangling it, I presumed. Then it flew away over the jagged building rooftops. I picked up the ring it had inscribed inside. To Doris White, with love, your beloved husband Fred, 2000 and something. The date was partially worn away. I then remembered that it was Mrs. White's ring. She gave me the bottle of alcohol the night she disappeared. It was proof that there was a Mrs. White. Then my mind searched subconsciously for something else. I found the half-filled glass. I took it and drank the alcoholic contents, to honour Mrs. White. Even though I was told not to drink any alcohol, as it may corrupt my twice daily Ministry of Archetype prescribed tablets, yet I drank anyway. I then lay depressed upon my couch, not fully comprehending who I was anymore. Why did I have this apartment when my role was a marginalized epsilon node? Who am I? Then the word Arcadia appeared in calligraphy coming out of the empty glass. Eureka! I now remembered. The confidence interval, the quotas, Mrs. White, the invitations to Arcadia, proof of the unbiased genocide, the statistical oppression. The bottle of alcohol and the ring were distributed lagged, exogenous shocks that had resonated, undetected, uninferred, throughout the great utopian statistical model, until now. I then felt the overpowering urge to escape this repressive statistical utopian state immediately. I decided to leave the apartment whilst the statistical router plug lay unplugged upon the living room floor. I had to leave right now, or never.